So we are here talking about the themes of the multiplication of perspectives and of circulation. And in thinking about both of these problems, particularly a dialogical approach to both of them, our small group, Pradnya, Cecile, and I, decided to develop a very close reading of an article by Cécile Froment. This was going to be the basis for our dialogue. So in some ways, we'll bring you into our process. It's a funny way to do a public discussion. It's a discussion about reading. And we're in some ways bringing you into our own practice of closely reading each other's work in a way to model a generous aesthetic practice of attentive reception and indulgent engagement. How rarely we get to actually indulge in each other's work. Circulation is ever identified with the mobility it implies. What is less understood are those moments during which the thing that circulates touches down and exchanges hands, gets passed around, those events in which an object is handled and thought and used and seen in a specific place at a specific time. For that, we wanted to think through a practice of turning a thing over and over again together and to bring an audience into that process after it had already begun. In this case, the things to be turned over are material artifacts, as well as the scholarly ideas that have allowed us to understand them more clearly, or have even in some cases performed an ekphrasis of those objects. So before we began, when we first met, I asked Cécile if she would select an essay for our discussion. And she selected an essay that I have very happily marked up in many ways and will be referring to this afternoon or late morning. It's called Under the Sign of the Cross in the Kingdom of Congo, Religious Conversion and Visual Correlation in Early Modern Central Africa. It was published in Res in 2011. So at some point in our conversation, I'll ask Cécile why she selected this particular piece. But through our discussions of it, we also came to a piece that I co-wrote with Alishine Osman called Traversals, In and Out of the Dadaab Refugee Camps. This was published in Perspecta 2 years ago. So both of these essays in different ways move from object to object, and their authors are looking very closely at objects. I want to say of Cécile's piece that a great deal of life and love is in this article. There's a great deal of seeing and feeling the past. So some of what will come out today, hopefully, is that sensibility and feeling. It's an essay that moves through a series of careful and very attentive considerations of multiple objects. Let me see if I can bring us to the first object. These are the two essays. So the first image that she shares with us is a page from an illustrated manuscript from the 1740s by Italian veterans of the mission to the Congo in Central Africa. It shows a monumental cross installed in front of a church with a grave in front. This cross inhabits the center of the image, the physical center of the image, visual center of the image. And on the left side is a Capuchin friar and his acolytes conducting a ceremony. On the right side is the local community, also conducting a ceremony. As Cécile writes, and I'll read directly from her work, So the sign of the cross is at the center of the watercolor, and at the crossroads of the several visual syntaxes and religious beliefs that permeate the image. In the vignette of the scene, it represents two different religious discourses. Two modes of interpretation have converged and now overlap. The monumental cross and smaller crucifixes taking part in the event serve for the Capuchin as univocal warrants of worship to the Christian God. They are also the point of the scene where Catholic and Congo religious traditions meet and blur between Congo ritual offerings to the soul of the deceased, holy water and incense. A univocal European or Congo reading of the ceremony depicted does not exhaust the religious significance of the scene, of the ritual practices it portrays, and of the objects it describes. Rather, the Capuchin sensual Christianity rendered in the theatrical staging of the ceremony, complete with music and perfume, here enters in dialogue with the devotions, Christian or otherwise, of the Congo protagonists, all happening in the shadow of the monumental cross. How should we attend to this? So I'll propose a few frames. And the first that we discussed was about instabilities of meaning. One of the first problems that I believe this essay asks us to register is that of the instability of meaning that is a condition of circulation. As objects change hands or share new spaces in social lives, the traditions within which they are understood must confront each other. In this case, Cécile also writes, the abstract idea of the cross, as well as its visual manifestations, emerged as a platform for artistic and religious ideas to be communicated across cultures. The cross is an intersection that allows travelers and hosts to co-script the Congo landscape. She continues to write, it formed a space of correlation, an activating ground where new conceptions and visual forms were molded that encompassed and transcended both European and Central African religious ideas and modes of representation. So let's talk for a moment about correlation. Correlation and co-relation. Correlation refers to both the relationship and connection between two things and the process of establishing it. So that's two frames of meaning that we'll work with here. This is different from the work of translation that Professor Bashir brought to us a moment ago, in which there is an attempt at transformation and a desire to achieve stability of meaning after a set of concepts has been converted. Contact produces boundaries, even as it produces the traversal of the boundaries, in mutually constituted spaces that Cécile names as spaces of correlation. This process of contact and co-inhabitation of a space of correlation emphasizes precisely the mutual activity of co-constituting that space, the work of co-relating within a space. I related that practice to one in a multi-part dialogue I engaged in with Mr. Alishin Osman. He's a colleague who spent his childhood and youth as a refugee in the UNHCR settlement in Ifo camp near Dadaab, Kenya. He and I co-wrote this article, Traversals, for the Yale Architecture Student Journal Perspecta, in which we examined together a set of photographs that we each collected. We discussed our individual experiences of moving in and out of the refugee camps. We each contributed images, and we recorded and transcribed and co-edited our dialogue for publication. And in examining these photographs together, such as this one of a grave site in a refugee camp, I believe we modeled the problem that Cécile Fromont identifies, of coming upon a space of correlation. There was no doubt some forms of understanding, communication, and friendship between me and Alishine. However, we were also moving in some ways in parallel, just as we were tracing through our conversation our plural experiences of traversing the border into and out of the camp. There are ways in which we could not understand each other's meanings, and perhaps only commit to seeing the objects that co-constituted the space of the camp, which we tried to capture, which each of us tried to capture in the photographs we gathered. And this is a photograph that he collected. So with this analogy between Cécile's text and this one, I want to signal those two meanings of correlation, the idea of co-relation, the relationship between two meanings, as well as the process of establishing the relationship. I'd like to underscore the poetics of a space of correlation, in Cécile Froment's terminology, that such a space gestures toward commitments made to co-constituting it. These poetics may even suggest an ethics, as problematic as that concept may be, in the arenas of power represented by religious and humanitarian environments of exchange. So as you study this very interesting image very closely, I'll move on to another point that I think we can discuss, which is thinking from the material or the singular toward the abstract or the scalar. Cécile Froment's essay performs a rigorous analysis of the schematic motif of the cross and the diamond. She shows how in two-dimensional abstraction found in rock painting and engraving, the cross expands into a diamond shape and the diamond shape collapses into a cross. And again, I'll read a bit from her essay in order to explain what we're getting at. So the cruciform shape appears, she says, in rock paintings, weaving patterns, and engravings in their simplest expression as two intersecting lines, as well as in intricate geometric derivations inspired by weaving patterns. Elaborate textiles and carved ivory tusks, eagerly collected by the early modern European elite for their cabinets of curiosity, which Kader Attia has reminded us of, as well as archaeological material, illustrate the prevalent Congo visual syntax at the time of the entrance of the kingdom into European history. Across the media, design patterns articulated lines, intersections, and overlaps in varied knot-like motifs organized around a central focus point and ultimately suggesting a diamond shape. I don't know how clear this is, but if you can see right at the location of the cross, there's a diamond shape above the Jesus figure. I'll talk more about that in a moment. I wanted to read directly from her writing just so you understand the texture and density of what she's describing. She makes use of rigorous readings of the materiality and visuality of Congo Christian crosses, discussing a complex yet consistent iconography that grew at the crux between Christian and Congo religious and visual syntax. So in this Latin cross, she calls out certain figural elements. Is there a pointer? Is this? Oh, lovely. Okay. So she calls out these ancillary figures all, across the entire cross, the incised diamond shape here, and also the etched borders. So the cross is part of an extant corpus of portable, elaborately crafted objects for use by individuals or small groups, as opposed to the large symbolic crosses being used to narrate the power of the Congo crown or its legitimacy within the Christian world that you saw in the previous illustrated manuscript image. So the cross in this image displays the adoption of certain motifs from the Latin European tradition, and I'll use the work of historian of medieval art Gregory Breida to describe this a little bit. You see a loincloth bunching up on the right side of the figure. These striations imply a loincloth. The gathering and striations suggest that the cloth is only covering the loins, which is a Western medieval visual form. You see angels collecting blood from the wounds on either side, another common motif. Striations at the top here simulate an emaciated Christ. They refer to the bones of the rib cage in line with late medieval depictions of the rib cage, which explicitly make bones innumerable in following prophet Isaiah on the coming of the Messiah, who said, "When tortured and killed, his bones will be numbered." So Italian theologians, such as the Capuchin who animates Cécile Froment's text, embroidered the Passion and the Crucifixion. They looked to the Old Testament. And that's some of what's appearing in this Latin cross. Yet, as Cécile Froment notes, from the rare written sources documenting the production, We know that the crosses were fashioned from local and imported brass by Congo artists working in workshops without European supervision. There's no indication here of friars' involvement in that production. There were many European examples that were sought by local patrons in the Congo and then studied and reworked by local artists. And I'll remind you of Sean's point at the end of the last dialogue about community production of objects. In Cécile's argument, without downplaying the very real violence and disruption of the Atlantic slave trade, she says, and I quote, "To insist on the importance of shedding the misleading conception that sees European cultural assaults as the only motor of change in pre-colonial and colonial Africa." She makes the case that the new faith entered into the intellectual realm of the Congo without overarching epistemological violence or epistemic rupture between a pre-Christian past and a Christian present. As such, the material artifacts become activated very differently than we might expect, through a materiality and an authorly attentiveness by artists and designers whose work does not represent a structurally oppressive adoption of religious motifs. These are the questions I believe that Pradnya was hinting at in her discussion of Malinche. She discusses how this was threatening to the clerics, that the fluidity between Christian and non-Christian symbols and ideas provided evidence for them of idolatry. The cross itself was one of these symbols. It's a cross, after all, but you see, for example, in the location of the diamond, in the very central location, it alludes to and also stands in for the halo of Jesus. Further evidence of this fluidity between Congo symbol and Christian icon, and the possible absorption of the latter into the former, might be found in the diffusion of the crosses after centralized Congolese power was weakened and the Capuchins had withdrawn. At that point, you start to see crosses moving across the landscape. Cécile reads this in the finding of a local style of cross that emerged in the province of Mbata in the 17th and 18th centuries, through a rigorous stylistic analysis of a cross that was excavated in the 20th century, which resembled those used in the 1650s during the initial period of Capuchin presence in the Congo. She finds the possibility of the cross effectively evolving on its own, without the direction of Christian or Congo leaders. This suggests that there might have been multiple instances of autonomous development of objects that express, in her words, new Congo Christian thought. This suggests that a cross, whose analysis began in the material, has ended with a gesture to the abstract, to the scalar. It has scaled up. Rooted in situated practices of making, the crosses also enable us to think about a larger scale of activity, a great territory of a blended Congo Christian life world. I'd like to underscore that these autonomous, perhaps anarchic orientations toward the social life of material objects points to another thing we might learn from the problem of circulation, as a condition that frames human interactions and meetings in the past and the present. Circulation leaves us with an epistemological opening, and some of that will be what we talk about today. I'd like to leave us with this thought of the epistemological opening, the question of how evidence and artifacts actually work to create forms of knowledge, and also to think on religion against the backdrop of the secular modern, what Pradnya has pointed to for us in the landscape, with the tomb as landscape. And with that, I'll pass this on to Cécile.